When we analyze international politics, we must discard sentimentality and focus on how the world actually works. And the world operates on the basis of power and competition between great powers in a condition of anarchy. The statement made by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz on January 14, 2026, reported by Politico, is a classic example of how structural pressure within the international system eventually forces state leaders to return to reality, no matter how hard they tried to ignore it in the past. Merz called Russia Europe's largest neighbor and spoke about the necessity of finding balance. These are not just words from a politician. This is an acknowledgement of a fundamental geopolitical truth that I and other realists have emphasized for decades. Russia is a great power, and it is not going anywhere. You cannot simply erase it from the security equation without creating conditions for a permanent and extremely dangerous conflict. To understand why Merz is saying this now, at the beginning of 2026, we must look at the bigger picture. In the international system, states are driven primarily by concerns for their own security and survival. Germany is the industrial heart of Europe. For decades, its economic prosperity was built on cheap and reliable energy from Russia. When that foundation was destroyed, especially after the Nord Stream pipeline incidents, Germany found itself facing a colossal strategic deficit. This is not merely about how much it costs to heat homes in Halle or Dessau. It is about preserving Germany as a major industrial power. In conditions of anarchy, the loss of economic power leads to the loss of political influence. Merz, a pragmatist at heart, understands that without some form of modus vivendi with Moscow, Germany will continue down the path of deindustrialization. And a deindustrialized Germany cannot lead Europe. Look at the context of his speech. He traveled to Eastern Germany. This is an extremely important detail. In realist theory, we often say domestic politics are secondary to foreign policy. But when foreign policy begins to directly threaten social stability, leaders are forced to react. Eastern regions of Germany have always had a more sober and pragmatic view of relations with the East. Merz claims his words have no regional subtext, but we understand he is probing for a new domestic political consensus. He sees that the electoral success of parties calling for normalization of relations is not accidental. It is a symptom of deep dissatisfaction with the current course, which many consider suicidal for German interests. Now let us move to the balance of power, a key concept in realist theory. For 4 years, we have watched the West, led by the United States, attempt to fundamentally weaken Russia by using Ukraine as a tool. I have always said this was a catastrophic mistake. Ukraine is not a vital strategic interest for the United States, but it is an existential interest for Russia. When you corner a great power, it will fight. And here we are in 2026. Ukraine is devastated. Hundreds of billions of euros have been spent. Russia is still there and is not going anywhere. 150 billion euros in European aid is a huge amount, but it did not fundamentally change the balance of power. On the contrary, it drained European arsenals and budgets. Merz speaks of balance with Moscow because he understands that the current policy does not lead to victory. It leads to endless exhaustion. In international relations, balance is the only way to ensure stability. If one side seeks total dominance, it inevitably provokes a reaction and conflict. The European security architecture built on excluding Russia proved unsustainable. Merz is effectively acknowledging that Russia is a European power. This may sound obvious, but in the context of the last 4 years, it is revolutionary for a Western leader. It is an admission that geography is destiny. You cannot move Russia to another part of the planet. It is interesting to observe the reactions of other players. Emmanuel Macron in France says the same thing about the need for dialogue and realism. France traditionally strives for greater European autonomy from the United States. Italy, suffering from high energy prices and stagnation, supports this trend. We see a bloc forming within the EU that realizes its interests do not fully align with Washington or London. Britain, safely on its island and less dependent on Russian gas, can afford to continue harsh rhetoric. But for Germany, this is a matter of life and death for its industrial model. When Merz speaks about peace and freedom beyond 2026, he is looking long-term. He understands that the United States is increasingly distracted by China. For Washington, Beijing is the main rival. At some point, Americans will inevitably reduce their presence in Europe to shift resources to the Indo-Pacific. If by then Europe has not stabilized relations with Russia, it will find itself in an extremely vulnerable position. This is what I call burden shifting. Americans are transferring responsibility for Europe's security to Europeans, who suddenly discover that without Russia, security is impossible. A critical aspect is Merz's change in tone. In June 2025, he called calls with Putin unproductive. What changed? Reality changed. A realist does not cling to ideological dogmas when they contradict facts, and the facts are these. Sanctions did not collapse the Russian economy. Russia was not militarily defeated, and Europe's energy crisis became chronic. Political positioning is one thing. Governing in a crisis is another. Merz now behaves like a leader who understands that national interests demand course correction. We must also consider Russia's role. Moscow sees these signals. For the Kremlin, this confirms its thesis that Europe will eventually be forced to negotiate. From a realist perspective, Russia will use this softening tone to consolidate gains and weaken Western unity. This is natural great power behavior. The question is whether Europe can develop a unified position. So far, we see a deep split between continental powers and Britain, as well as internal EU tensions. Though 150 billion euros spent on Ukraine are now viewed through the prism of lost opportunities, that money could have gone into infrastructure, industry, and social needs. In an economic downturn, taxpayers begin asking why we are spending so much on a conflict that seems endless while our own economy shrinks. Merz hears these questions. His speech to the Chamber of Commerce is a signal to business. I understand your problems. I am looking for a way out. Many will accuse him of betraying values or weakness, but in big politics, values are often a cover for interests. When interests suffer too much, values rhetoric fades. The balance Merz speaks of is not about love or friendship with Russia. It is about recognizing its power and creating a system where both sides' interests are considered enough to avoid a major war. This is a modern version of the classical European concert of powers. Looking ahead to 2026 and beyond, we are entering what I would call a great rethinking. The unipolar Western moment is over. We live in a multipolar world where regional powers demand respect for their security space. Russia clearly defined its red lines. The West long believed it could ignore them. Now Merz effectively says, we hear you, let's find balance. But finding balance is extremely difficult. What does it mean in practice? Partial lifting of sanctions? Recognition of new territorial realities? A new European security structure where Ukraine becomes neutral rather than a NATO outpost? From a realist perspective, Ukraine's neutrality is the only logical way out. If Merz truly wants balance, he must understand this requires painful compromises. And here we will see the real test of his leadership. His opponents will point to his past statements and support for sanctions. But leaders of great powers often change course. Remember Richard Nixon, who built his career on anti-communism and then went to China to deal with Mao. Why? Because the balance of power changed. Merz may face a similar situation. Rapprochement with Moscow may be driven by the need to save Europe from economic collapse and excessive dependence on an increasingly unpredictable Washington. We must also note references to Greenland and Denmark in transatlantic tensions. This shows problems go beyond Ukraine. There are deep structural contradictions over resources, Arctic routes, and defense spending. All this pushes Europe toward a more independent course. We are witnessing geopolitics returning in its purest form. The romantic era of faith in a liberal world order is over. We are back in a world where territory, energy, and power balance matter. Merz's words are the first serious sign that Germany and then continental Europe are accepting this reality. This does not guarantee quick peace or a return to pre-2022 status quo. It marks the beginning of a long, difficult, and dangerous continental reformatting. Russia is Europe's largest neighbor. That cannot be changed. Finding balance with such a neighbor is the hardest task for any German chancellor since Bismarck or Adenauer. Merz has taken the first step. Whether he and others have the courage to finish it remains to be seen. States act based on interests. Germany's interest in 2026 is avoiding becoming a deindustrialized periphery, torn by conflicts it cannot win. Balance does not mean absence of competition. Russia and Europe will remain competitors, but competition must be managed, not total war. Billions spent on weapons could serve the economy if a stable security system existed. Merz sees this. His optimism for 2026 rests on hope that realism will prevail over ideology, but hope is not a strategy. Strategy is calculation of power and intentions. Russia has shown determination. Now Europe must show whether it is capable of pragmatism needed for survival in this harsh world. Merz's text in Halle is not just a speech to businessmen. It is a manifesto of a new Eastern policy emerging from the ashes of the old order. Europe is tired of a conflict it cannot end on its own terms. The economic price is too high. The Eastern great power is not broken. In such conditions, balance is not a choice. It is a necessity. We must watch how these ideas turn into diplomatic steps. So far, we see only outlines. But the fact such words come from Germany's leader shows tectonic shifts in world politics continue. The old security architecture is dying. This confirms my long-held theory that NATO expansion and attempts to pull Ukraine into the Western orbit were a fundamental provocation that destroyed stability in Europe. Now, after 4 years of bloodshed, leaders reach the same conclusion through suffering and losses. Merz is trying to save what remains of European influence. This is a difficult game. Without considering Russia's interests, there will be no lasting peace. That is a harsh truth. History shows instability ends when great powers sit down and recognize each other's spheres of influence. That concept is unfashionable, but it is how the real world works. Merz's words open the door to this discussion. Balance is impossible without mutual guarantees. Freedom for some cannot be built on absolute insecurity for others, especially nuclear powers. We see the beginning of the end of an era when the West believed it could impose its will without consequences. 2026 will shatter that illusion. Merz's path will be thorny. He will be criticized at home and abroad, but he has no alternative if he wants Germany to remain significant. This is realism in action. Let us deepen how adaptation will occur. The international system is not a polite dinner. It is a harsh competitive arena where mistakes are punished by decline. Merz's balance speech admits that turning Ukraine into a Western bastion failed. This failure has systemic consequences. Germany's survival as a sovereign power requires restoring its industrial base, which depended for 60 years on energy symbiosis with the East. You cannot replace pipeline gas with American LNG costing 3 to 4 times more and expect BASF to stay competitive. No ideology can change this equation. We see structural coercion. Leaders speak freely while resources exist. When resources end and factories move abroad, illusions evaporate. If Merz cannot reach an understanding with Moscow, Germany becomes a museum of former glory. In anarchy, you either have power or submit. Economic power is the foundation of all power. Therefore, balance with Russia is not about liking Putin. It is about preserving Germany as a serious global actor. Now Ukraine. For 4 years, we heard it must win and restore 2014 13 borders. Realists knew this was fantasy. Russia views Ukraine as life or death. The West sees it as secondary. When one side fights for survival and the other for peripheral interests, the first wins. Russia is ready to pay any price. The West is not. Aid has a ceiling. Fatigue grows. Continuing arms shipments only prolongs agony and risks direct conflict with a nuclear power. Balance means maximalist goals are over. Deals are coming. And deals mean recognizing facts on the ground. Russia controls territory and will not give it up. Any balance includes Ukraine's neutrality. Ukraine will not join NATO. It must be a buffer state. This is the only path to stability. Let us discuss the U.S. role. American foreign policy faces identity crisis. Some want to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. Others realize China is the main rival. Smart strategy would have been to pull Russia away from China. Instead, Washington pushed Moscow into Beijing's arms. A historic mistake. Merz sees Americans will pivot to Asia. Then Europe will face an angry, armed Russia alone. So Berlin must normalize now while the U.S. umbrella still exists. Responsibility shifting continues. Americans shift burden, but Europeans are unprepared. No unified army, no unified threat perception. For Poland and Baltics, Russia is an existential threat. For Germany, France, Italy, it is a difficult but necessary partner. This split will deepen. Merz tries to prevent EU collapse by proposing a course that satisfies all interests. But balancing Warsaw and Moscow requires Bismarck-level diplomacy. Sanctions rarely work on great powers. They hurt, but do not force surrender. They stimulate autarky and Eastern trade. By 2026, Russia is more integrated with China, India, Global South. Western leverage weakens. Sanctions hurt Europe too, if not more. Industrial decline in Germany directly follows broken energy ties. To restore balance, parts of sanctions must go gradually. His trip to Eastern Germany matters. People there feel consequences. They want work and a future. If policy impoverishes citizens for abstract ideals abroad, governments lose legitimacy. Merz sees rising alternative forces. Course change is also about internal stability, European autonomy. Macron was right about NATO's brain death. NATO drags Europe into conflicts not serving its interests. Merz's words move toward French position. If Germany and France agree on Russia, the world map changes. True multipolarity emerges. But Europe must stop being Washington's appendage. That requires courage. Putin is a realist. He believes actions, not words. Merz's statement signals strategy works. Russia endured pressure. Now it waits for offers. Russia's position is stronger than 2 years ago. Economy adapted. Ties with China strengthened. Territories held. Any balance must reflect this reality. It will not restore old security systems. It will create new ones where Russia has veto power. Critics call this appeasement. But appeasement is giving vital things, hoping aggression stops. Here we recognize legitimate security interests. NATO expansion created this crisis. Recognizing mistakes is common sense. All of 2026 will be spent searching for balance. Diplomacy behind closed doors will intensify. Even Britain will debate its isolation. Technology gap matters. While Europe fought, US and China surged in AI and green tech. Europe lags because resources were consumed by conflict. Every war month deepens irrelevance. To compete, Europe needs peace on eastern borders and access to Russian resources. Global South matters. BRICS ignored sanctions. They trade with Russia and profit. Western hegemony is an illusion. Germany cannot isolate itself from the world. Balance with Russia restores global standing. We may see a Korean-style freeze. Not ideal, but likely. Merz will push ceasefire and long negotiations. Pressure on Kiev will grow. Aid will decline. This is harsh reality. Small states are bargaining chips. Merz's message gives Germans light at tunnels. End. Pragmatism against ideology. He positions himself as adult in the room. Russia will not be easy partner. It will seek to weaken U.S. influence. That is balance of power. Cold War taught arms control. We need new security architecture based on equilibrium, not expansion. If Merz succeeds, he saves Europe from self-destruction. If not, we see decline and new wars. 2026 is a turning point. Old order dead. New not born. Napoleon tried to change geography. Hitler tried. Both failed. West tried through institutional expansion. Result is clear. We must accept Russia as it is, not as we wish. That is realism. Balance is not end of history. It allows history to continue without catastrophe. Merz made a step. Others must follow. Watch France, Washington, China. States maximize security. Europe thought American dominance guaranteed safety. Now this assumption collapses. Germany feels it most. Balance is a search for new footing. This is a return to classical diplomacy. Interests over slogans. 2026 may mark this return. We must discard emotions and analyze reality. That is how to avoid new mistakes. Now we must analyze how balance will affect the EU. The EU tried to act as normative power. In a world of force, that fails. Independent German Eastern policy causes friction. Poland and Baltics feel betrayed. They invested politically in confrontation. Any Berlin-Moscow deal is nightmare. Merz must work hard to prevent EU collapse. But German interests will prevail. Power hierarchy decides whose interests win. We must consider nuclear deterrence. Russia is a nuclear great power. Trying to defeat it was madness. Nuclear weapons prevent such scenarios. Leaders likely received clear signals from Moscow. Balance moves away from nuclear brink. Ignoring nuclear reality is playing with fire. Look at 2026 economics. Countries keeping ties with East perform better. India grows. China recovers. Russia shows resilience. Europe stagnates. Merz cannot ignore numbers. If Europe isolates, it becomes backwater. Balance restores access to Eurasian markets. U.S. internal dynamics matter. Isolationism grows. Americans question Ukraine spending. Pressure forces Washington to change priorities. Merz knows U.S. support is not eternal. If America leaves, Germany is vulnerable. Merz's initiative is insurance. We witness sunset of liberal world order. It was based on U.S. hegemony and belief all would become democratic. Reality is diverse and conflictual. Great powers always compete. Spheres of influence are natural. Merz recognizes end of universalism. We return to Westphalian system. What about Ukraine long-term? Kiev's role is rethought. Once seen as defending values, now as undermining security. Ukraine shifts from asset to liability. Aid will depend on readiness for talks. Russia is patient. Time is on its side. Europe weakens. Merz admits the West cannot win war of attrition. Political settlement is only way. Merz tries to seize initiative. International politics is tragedy. Structure pushes to conflict. Understanding structure helps avoid catastrophe. Merz begins to understand rules. Russia is reality, not a problem to solve. Balance, respect, geography must guide new order. Do not seek morality in politics. Seek calculation. Merz calculates Germany's survival. Without Russia, Europe declines. This is not about values, but power and security. We enter a new era. Merz's speech is first chord in long symphony of geopolitical restructuring. If we follow realism, we can build a stable system and avoid major war. That is all we can hope for. And that is what Friedrich Merz now seems to pursue.